Welcome to our final installment of studying The Future is Open. I have to say, I never cease to be amazed. Actually, in general, studying the Dharma, there's so much to learn, really. And maybe I'm just a slow learner. Anyway, it's certainly a privilege to be sharing this material. So today we have 3 chapters. So yes, might go a little bit over time. I hope that's all right. So much of what we're discussing here is entirely experiential. So to understand what we're talking about, well, it's not just that we're sitting in meditation, but it does require this introspection that looks at what's happening in our mind. And hopefully that comes with a humble recognition that we're confused, but also the upbeat recognition that we can do something about it. Our confusion is removable. This is, of course, what is key here. But in studying karma, we're beginning to understand the conditions that are basic to our experience. So in chapter 11, we work with ego in our practice. Now, as far as we're concerned, then ego is something that we need to be honest about. It's not as if when we practice, then we forget about ego for some time being. It's very much present. And the value of the practice is that we have some sense that we can sidestep, we can be free of ego. If we pay attention, then actually the grip that ego normally has on us is not really possible. So, as with the line just before, in terms of we can unravel samsara through the practice of meditation. Not just meditation, but also the entire path, also post-meditation, where we have this, where we engage skillful means with which we work with our phenomena and also dismantle the grip on ego. Now, the basic sense of ego, or the basic basic instinct of ego, is this vague but nevertheless pervasive thought that we actually exist. It's just the assumption. In fact, the entire Western tradition of psychology and phenomenology operates with the notion that we exist. Descartes and all of that. I think, therefore I am. And of course, this has been challenged from many different quarters, but still there is very much a sense of reality in most, you can say, in most systems, philosophical thoughts, and so forth, and also within just our own experience. So we have this thought that we're for real. Now, the thing is, this reality is patchy. And it's almost as if ego, in order to solidify itself, continually stirs up confusion in order to sustain itself. So we continually have this situation of an ego and a perception of reality, which, if we investigate, is just patchwork. It's just moments. It's just conditions that together end up looking as if there's one big, like Trungpa Rinpoche says, one big sheet, one big pervasive reality. Now, when we think of ourselves and our identity and so forth, when we think of our being and our mind and so forth, it's actually what we're referring to. The whole sense of identity and experience is actually then this patchwork. And that is what we essentially refer to as mind. The thing about the mind is it is not continuous. And of course, in the Abhidharma and elsewhere, we identify how consciousness exists in terms of little moments. Like, we have a mala, and we have then these different beats that give a sense that there's something continual, but in fact, it's just moment by moment by moment. So in that sense, this perception of continuity is really flawed. It's a mistake. So we have all these perceptions, thoughts, and so forth, but there is no actual continuous self. This is where we need to wake up and see what we haven't seen previously. Trungpa Rinpoche says, mind is constantly trying to transfer its identity and existence from moment to moment, with a tremendous amount of failure and constant forgetfulness. The transfer of one thought, one theme, is very short-lived. Traditionally, it's said to last only 1/60th of a second. And even that so-called existence is divided into 3 sections: about to happen, actually happen, and fading away, coming, remaining, and going. We don't have very much of an existence at that level at all. So although the mind is regarded as a big deal, it is just patchwork. Every instant of perception constructs a memory of a unitary phenomenon. And that's the thing. We attribute solidity to our perceptions and so forth, even though they actually don't have it. But we see this sort of, here we have a hand, right? We'll just say, well, that's a hand. But actually, if we look at it, it's a composite. It's conditioned by various phenomena. Finger, yeah, but then again, also the finger is composed of many different elements, right? And each of these elements also we can subdivide. So we have an impression of something unitary, but like Trungpa Rinpoche says, like the hum of bees that sound like an orchestra, if we come close, every little bee is making its own little sound, right? But just from a distance, it sounds like just one tone, right? So we have countless such instances of experience which create a sense of reality. So this is where all along in the Buddhist teaching, we try to penetrate this assumption of reality, this perception of appearance, where we begin to see, yes, there's appearance, and yet this appearance is not solid. It's empty. It's empty of ultimate reality. And so that's where we can say, yes, conventionally there's appearance, but ultimately there's no real, nothing has ultimate reality. So these perceptions then, they give us a sense of reality, and they form the basis of memories. And on the basis of these memories, we have the afflicted mind, the kleshas, the conflicting emotions, where we then, on the basis of that, then we begin to have patterns. We act on these afflictions. These actions then become patterns in themselves. So the thing is, we, again, as sentient beings, driven by madness, our attachment, aversion, pride, jealousy, dullness, we act very strangely. And we would say these bewildered actions are absurd and embarrassing. And that's putting it mild, because they also drive us into intense suffering. But it is necessary for us then, given our situations here, that we begin with having this recognition that we are caught in some rather embarrassing and absurd patterns of action, and there is something greater. There is something that is sacred, even holy, even religious, something that we aspire to and regard as something that stands outside these patterns. Trungpa Rinpoche says all those things go on in your mind constantly, whether you are wise or stupid, rich or poor. And when you begin to look at yourselves, you feel that the whole thing is somewhat ridiculous. But you can't get away from that kind of problem right at the beginning. There is a need to become somewhat religious and to develop a sense of sacredness. You need to feel that there is room for sacredness, for further evolution, in spite of your little ego. So there is a remedy. There is a remedy of introducing something which lies beyond our ordinary scope. And it's where we stop and begin to actually look and see. We all know what it's like to be stressed out, or in one way or another, just disjointed and not functioning properly, where then it actually helps to just take a break. We stop. And the thing is, when we stop and we begin to calm down, it's not as if something miraculous is taking place. It's not like the grace of somebody out there looking on us because we've been good boys or girls. And it's not just random. It's when we take a break from our patterns, we're exhausted or whatever, something sane begins to emerge. And this is what we're cultivating through the practice of meditation, that we're actually introducing an element of sanity that doesn't come from anywhere and is not something that's just randomly happening, but we're creating the exact causes and conditions for something that cures us of this condition. And this is then the logic and the approach of meditation. In meditation, we actually deal with what causes these patterns. So in general, when we rest, things sort of troubles dissipate, we're less stressed. But with meditation, we're actually right down to what in computer programming is called the BIOS, right down at where things actually are being, you could say, the most basic causes and conditions are being put into place. And this is what we're doing when we're practicing the practice of shamatha vipassana, when we begin to disengage the ordinary unconscious, just trailing along with our thoughts, and begin to bring the mind back to actually being present. In meditation, we familiarize ourselves with non-existence. We begin to become used to the fact that these things that we ordinarily latch onto as real don't necessarily possess that reality. So we are where we ordinarily habitually escape this reality through all sorts of distraction. In this context of non-distraction, we actually begin to become comfortable with and accept the fact that phenomena don't exist the way that we think they do. And of course, ultimately, we recognize that they don't have any existence whatsoever apart from just being appearances of our projections. So we disrupt the fickleness of our bewilderment in the sense that with meditation, we're not necessarily creating anything new. We're just stopping confusion. We're stopping this superficial condition of being bewildered. We look at what is and find peace and workability. That is mindfulness or shamatha. So this is where we are peaceful, not in the sense of just being relaxed and not having any thoughts, but it's more that we begin to have some clarity about just what we are. And this is where we see it's workable. And so this condition of being present is what we refer to as shamatha or shine, or a condition of calm abiding. So we take comfort in resting and not jumping about. Now this sounds nice, and we could romanticize that to some extent, but it actually goes against the grain of our habitual patterns. So we know, if we've been practicing meditation for a while, we know that we're reluctant actually to settle down, and we are sort of inclined to keep ourselves busy. But this is where we need to be firm and actually have to begin to train ourselves in discovering that which is beyond our ordinary patterns and habits, and that's where we then find comfort resting and not jumping about. By practicing meditation, Trungpa Rinpoche says, you develop sympathy for yourself and a friendly and healthy attitude. Your jumpiness and not wanting to stay on any one point come from aggression, from disliking yourself. In spite of the jumpiness, there is a feeling of gentleness and goodness, reasonability and decency. You actually have learned to be with yourself. That may be somewhat terrible, or at least difficult, but you also begin to feel that it is quite good, quite terrific. You can actually go as far as to be with yourself. You're simply learning to be. In meditation, we experience simply existing without embellishment, actually being. We're very often used to doing. We're not so used to just being. It's in here then that we experience lack of substance. And ordinarily, we need reference points to secure ourselves. Our insecurity requires something that feeds us. It can be objects of desire, can also be objects of aggression. But the bottom line is that our sense of reality, this sense of a substantial I, which is essentially so insecure, it requires this ongoing madness where we attribute solidity to things that actually don't have solidity, and particularly our own existence not having any solidity is being sort of the reality of that is being how do you say veiled, covered by this continual actions that try to feed this delusion of substance. And with meditation, we begin to familiarize ourselves with our lack of substance. So in meditation, this non-existence is not seen as a problem. It might be painful, but with an understanding of the lack of existence in both ourselves and in phenomena, when we have this view, then it's not really seen as a problem. So with the practice of meditation, we reorient from the ordinary survival mentality, the ordinary instinct of me, and the ongoing narratives that feed me. We begin to extract ourselves from the grip that these assumptions have. We accept our naked experience, raw and rugged. Trungpa Rinpoche says, sitting meditation removes psychological pain. By looking into your existence, survival mentality is cut out altogether. You begin to feel extremely raw and rugged right at the beginning. That is how a beginner's meditation practice should be. Raw and rugged, with no excuses and no promises. So this is a very honest experience. We're not particularly developing a new experience like, wow, it's great to meditate, or I've seen the light, or I have a new philosophy. It's just us being with ourselves, raw, rugged, just as it is, no embellishments. Through exertion, we reveal that which is not mind, meaning we begin to step outside the cycle of our confusion. This non-theistic journey is not on the premises of ego's profit. So we might engage in spiritual path thinking that this is going to feed us further, give us sort of a blissful experience, and we can be comfortable in that. But that actually, this is not what we do in what we call the non-theistic journey. Let me say, what we call non-theistic is that which does not latch on to reference points. And it is kind of what we could, it might sound as if it's just about not being religious, but it also includes non-religiosity in the sense of materialist or atheist views as well. And it basically amounts to dogma. So in the freedom from dogma, or what we sometimes call the middle way, we're not about perpetuating the ego's ordinary premise of having to have some reference point. And this is why also we, some of you read the way of the, what's called the Introduction to the Middle Way by Chandrakirti, and also other places, Nagarjuna also says, they say it's the only way. So until then, we're still latching on to ego's reference points. So in the sense of Madhyamika, or the middle way, being the only way, is not particularly a fundamentalist claim. It's actually just the claim that as long as we are fundamentalists, we're not going to be free. And all these various extremes, they are in a way fundamentalism. So we could have like I've earlier said, we could have the opinion that opinions get in the way. And that in itself, of course, is an opinion, but it nevertheless is valid. Now, when we then in this way persevere on the path, our ordinary trips, our ordinary reference points, and our karma and so forth, they of course arise, as they always will, but they also, through our insight, we're also not perpetuating them. And that's where they're just seen as ripples on or waves on the ocean. Trungpa Rinpoche says it's like clearing a field. First, we cut down the crops and take them out by not relating with subconscious gossip. Then we begin to remove the seeds. We have a great drought, so the ground is empty once more. That is our first attempt to stop samsara. It sounds like a dreadful idea from the point of view of wanting to perpetuate samsara, but from another point of view, it's quite delightful. It is tremendously good news that we can actually short-circuit samsara by sitting practice. So when we're sitting, then of course the thoughts come, and we could possibly begin to not relate to these, or rather not be carried away by this subconscious gossip. But then there's more subtle aspects also, and there will be more subtle aspects in the sense of first we have gross thoughts, but then also there's the impulses that keep us addicted to wanting to have those narratives. And it's in not feeding these that we begin to go under the thoughts, also down to the place where the impulses originate. And that's where we begin to remove the seeds. So we cut down one thought. Trungpa Rinpoche says we might be thinking of a McDonald's hamburger, but then other more basic narratives are revealed. So we might catch that one, but then there's sort of the thought, well, who am I and what am I doing? What's the meaning with my life? And so forth. All these kind of more basic narratives will arise then. So we have this, you could say, continual attempt from ego to sort of really get us. So we might be able to sort of expose the sort of, we might be mindful when we're aware of some particular thoughts, like a noise outside. Somebody's cutting down a tree. We might hear a chainsaw. We might realize I'm being distracted by that. But then there's the more basic narratives, and these kind of thoughts about that sometimes get us. Insecurities or obsessions or whatever it might be. And this is where we need to persevere. Trungpa Rinpoche says we have to step on them and go beyond. It's not like we at this point say, oh, I can handle some things, but I can't handle the rest. And that's where we need to treat these more basic and subtle narratives the same way. We also need to recognize them and then again, not be carried away by them. And that's where we need to be firm. And it says it's a bit like when we have an injection, there's the resistance of the skin, and we need to push through. So in the Abhidharma teachings, there's quite a lot of mapping of all the various ways that the mind operates. And all of these, they are what lead us to continually perpetuate confusion, what perpetuates the rebirth in samsara. Now, when we have theism, and you could say the more spiritually materialistic approach, then there's the notion that, you get rid of all the bad stuff, but then you're stuck with the good stuff. And that's where we're still hanging on to reference points. Non-theism is the complete realization of egolessness. So non-theism here is synonymous with the middle way. Again, in meditation, we work first with what makes us crazy, as we do with shamatha. We're committed to the practice of mindfulness. And then later, we deal with the deeper assumptions that are implicit in theism. So it's gradually then we begin to deal with the more subtle aspects through a greater experience of vipassana. Trungpa Rinpoche says, what we are really concerned with is what we are now and how we could start as soon as possible to cut the samsaric root at this very moment. That seems to be our concern. The sooner the better. That is the function of the practice of meditation. Mindfulness is simply looking at ourselves and cutting the roots of bewilderment and jumpiness. It is being fully there. So this is not something that necessarily sits as a project that we need to attend to over time to be done one day, but is something that is immediately, you could say the challenge is present within the immediate, within the present moment. When you begin to cut the root of samsara, its ability to grow back is lessened. So it's not as if we're going to get rid of samsara. We're not going to get rid of our patterns as such right away, But again, we begin to have some sense that we're not necessarily held by these. So you have hit a nerve, ego is softened. So there's a place where we begin to see that the ego isn't in charge. Now, when we do that, it opens up to a whole new dimension and a more softer, raw experience. And that is maybe where we think, hey, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be a tough guy. I'm supposed to be in this way. My incredibly colorful, interesting personality. Hey, I want that back. And that's where we might actually take a defensive attitude. If we do that, Trungpa Rinpoche's point is, if we do that, then there's an element of jadedness that begins to take place. We become hardened and we become almost vaccinated to the path. And that's why he says it can be difficult to come back. He says, if you reject that and take a defensive attitude, trying to rebuild your whole ego-oriented approach, it's questionable whether you could come back and re-soften again. So in regard to the sitting practice of meditation, the idea is constancy, because each time you sit, you get softened more and more. If our intention to practice is to have more self-discipline, experience less conflict in our lives with others, which is painful. Is this different to what he's talking about with experiencing bliss? Personally, I just like a little less pain. Is that still coming from a self-centered place? Well, you could say there's an intelligence in there that doesn't want pain. We need to deal with that first. And then, like he's saying here, then gradually we can get at sort of the whole notion around the self. So as per slide 8, yeah. We want to, we first, naturally, and that's also what he talked about last time, we bring in as what we could call a certain spiritual materialist approach, which is, I'd like to be well. But then gradually also we recognize that the whole premise of this self-centering is in fact what causes our suffering. And so we realize for us to have genuine bliss, not just the cheap thrills, we need to actually let go of even the self-centering altogether. Yeah? Anyway, one step at a time. Auspicious coincidence. Now, this is a quite interesting chapter from the point of view, how do we navigate life? And what we're talking about here is quite an interesting topic, and is key topic in Buddhism, tendril, which means, yes, tendril is very often understood to mean auspicious coincidence, but it also is understood just as you could say the web of causes and conditions, basically just how things are. But of course, the point is that things are exactly what they are, in the sense that what comes out now, I might have eaten some bad food, and I'm going to break out in hives. See, that's very appropriate. In a sense, we could say that apart from the fact that I wouldn't like to have hives, then there is a certain auspiciousness in the sense that the result is exactly linked up to the cause. So of course we might choose what we like and dislike, but what is auspicious here is the sense that what takes place is entirely appropriate. So we can say links are taking place, but there's also, Trungpa Rinpoche is also going to talk a little bit about how to navigate, how to find, you could say, the right links also, which is then the particularly auspicious coincidence. So tendril in Tibetan, tenjing delwa jongwa, which means connected on the mutually connected, or nidana, means the conditions basic to anything. So anything that we have, any phenomenon that we have, essentially exists in terms of conditioning, in terms of tendril. So these conditions are auspicious. Tashi in Tibetan, or Mangalam in Sanskrit, in the sense that they are appropriate. They're exactly the result of the cause. As such, anything is based on infallible causation, and nothing is out of place. For that reason, karma is without reference to good or bad. Like I said before, I might eat some bad food, and certainly the hives that I break out in are not particularly pleasant for me. But basically, that's just how it is. It's you heat water and it starts to boil. That's not necessarily good or bad. It's just the way that results come about on the basis of causes. And this also means that everything is just continually working on the basis of these causes and conditions. There's nothing prearranged. It's not as if things are just heading one particular way. It entirely depends how we handle our reality. And that's why we could say up until the present, and we've talked about this many times, for sure, the present is constructed by what was in the past. Yeah, so that we can't change much. But on the basis of the future, like Trungpa Rinpoche says, is vacant. That's entirely up to us. Of course, again, something we've talked about quite a few times now, there is the element of the patterning that drives us in one particular way. So that we have to work with. But at the end of the day, we do have the possibility of choice. Otherwise, we just circle endlessly in samsara. And we do circle endlessly in samsara. But right now, then, the conditions for breaking this pattern is present. Trungpa Rinpoche says, everything as far as it exists is in the present situation. The potential of the future is in the present moment. Therefore, nothing can be prearranged or predestined. On the other hand, the whole thing is to a certain extent predestined because it is the past that presents us with the present situations. Predestination does go as far as that, to the present moment, and does not go beyond, right? Again, same thing. The past has brought us into the present moment. That's a given. Can't do anything about that. But that kind of predestination, in the sense of nothing can change, that doesn't go beyond the present moment. So this is a key element. And this is also where key element in the path. Through the practice of the path, there is increasing ability to then make choices. Particularly then meditation, because again, going down to the most basic layers of who we are, choices are made there on the basis of our impulses and so forth. And meditation is what enables us to be less driven and held by these impulses. So meditation is important in that it enables us to learn and relate to the present. This relating to the tendril, the auspicious conditions of the present, brings confidence and autonomy, because that is where we ordinarily just flounder and stumble along, whereas the moment that we begin to see the insubstantial nature of the impulses, then we begin to experience some autonomy with regards to our choices, and that's where then we discover this confidence. From here, you can develop tremendous of confidence. The future is open. And that, of course, is reflected in the practice of the path and how the practice of the path manifests. Seeing the auspiciousness of the present karma also indicates the future. Trungpa Rinpoche was famous for his divinations, for his mows, and in general for being a visionary. And it is often in the stories of great masters, there are often tales of, and very often references to great masters being able to see what will come just on the basis of what's there in the present moment. There's a story of when Milarepa offered a big cauldron to Mapa. Then Mapa, he took the cauldron. This was Milarepa's offering to receive teaching from Mapa. And Mapa said, and he quickly filled it with, I can't remember, butter or something like that. And he said, very good that you offered this. Well, the fact that the cauldron was empty means that you're going to, you'll receive the teachings, you'll do well, but it being empty means you're going to be lacking in sustenance. And then having filled the cauldron then is an indication that in the future, then the lineage, the Kagyu lineage, the practitioners there won't be lacking sustenance. So there is this ability, and this also takes place in a subtle way, and some of us are more sensitive to this than others, that we can actually see indications of where things are heading in one way or another. And you can also very often see great masters have an ability to kind of know what needs to be done, and also if there are obstacles, how to remove these, how to facilitate the accomplishment of what is desired, and so forth. So that is seeing the auspiciousness of the present karma and what will come. So a karmic link, for example, we say we have a karmic link, two people. That is, of course, based on two persons making independent choices. They're not like destined to be together, or there is some sort of preordained agenda, but it's more just that the conditions are there and the right conditions are there for something to take place. So, as with the 12 Nidanas, then all realities are linked to a genealogy of conditions. And Trungpa Rinpoche refers to the Arhat who goes into a cemetery, looks at a bone, says, where did this bone come from? Well, it comes from death. Where does death come from? It comes from birth. Where does birth come from? Etc., 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 down to the first link of the 12 Nidanas, which is ignorance. Trungpa Rinpoche says, having arrived at this point of being here, you question your result. Not only do you look back by way of an intellectual researching process, you also practice and experience what you are thinking about. Having experienced what you are thinking about makes all life situations become much clearer, more precise and obvious at the present moment, right here. Now this is tricky because we're not necessarily talking about getting absorbed in our thoughts, but there is a sense of just having some awareness of where things come from. So very often we go into speculation about the past. That's not what Trungpa Rinpoche is talking about here. More just being aware, a sense of awareness in the process of reflecting on what has brought about a particular situation. So understanding the chain of events that brought us here enables us to move forward. So we can read to some extent what has happened and what is the intelligent way forward. This, of course, is universal, but here we're talking about a more subtle approach. He says what we do with the present situation as it relates to the future is completely up to us. It is an open situation. So we're not tangled up in the past. We are aware of where we are right now, and there's some knowledge of the history, but at the same time, our focus is really on the possibilities of where we go from here and the sensitivity to the choices that we're given. So genuine commitment to the present situation is not ruled by ego, in the sense that the situation has its own sanity. And if we could be sensitive to that, then we can proceed. It's quite straightforward, but very often we're caught up in a lot of confusion in terms of our desires, our aversions, and so forth. So that's where ego gets in the way. But there is a place, there's a natural abiding sanity that's innate to us and to the situation that is there, present within us, which is not ruled by ego. So from here then, we acknowledge that when we understand that we've come to the present moment and there's not much we can do except just move ahead. So there is this sense of not being stuck with what we have experienced in the past, and more a sense of empowerment in the sense of we can move forward our journey. So we go along with the unique patterns and textures of the situation. And that requires that we get out of our heads and we get out of our speculation, and we're just sensitive to that. We have this aerial perspective that comes from not being caught up in our hopes and fears, that we actually are sensitive to the textures and the patterns of the situation. So this does not require that we very often do that. We think, I'm going to think and think and think and think, and this is what's happening out in the future. And we very often have a lot of already established scenarios happening in our mind where we, out of insecurity, wish, gosh, if I only knew what to do. See, that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about genuine, what was it again? The sort of genuine commitment to the present situation. This is more the hope and fear that we build up about the scenarios that we're imagining. And from that point of view, we would so much like to have some sort of blueprint or map that tells us exactly what we're supposed to do. But that's not happening. And actually, that would really not be a life as such. There was a movie a few years ago, and I hadn't thought of it until now, but there was a movie with Adam Sandler. I think it was called Click or something. And whenever he was in a painful situation, he could just fast forward. So he would get himself into these terrible sort of, situations, and then he had this device, time traveling device. So he'd just get out of there, and it was all done. And in no time, his life was over. And in fact, it hadn't been much of a life because he hadn't really been in touch with actual experience, the substance of life. Very profound movie. Anyway, what we are talking about here is that we would miss out if we had all the right directions. And in fact, what we have, and as we're navigating, is a very real relationship to pleasure and pain, to real confusion. This doesn't mean that we are heading towards just anguish. And that's a point actually in Matthew Ricard's book on happiness. He's talking about how very much in the French intellectual climate, and this is also pervasive across, the modern world, there's this whole thing that if we don't suffer, we're not really experiencing the fullness of life. That's not what we're talking about here. Yes, there will be plenty of pleasure and pain, but not necessarily in the neurotic sense. And in fact, the less there is the ego filtering, I want this, I don't want that, there is much more a situation of meeting every situation in its full, you could say, raw experience of being pleasure or pain, even confusion. So this is where we enter into that. And that is where there's nothing that's predetermined at all. But nevertheless, we're navigating on the sense of just relating to the conditions of the situation. What very often happens, and like I was saying before, we very often are caught up in imagining the scenarios about the future, planning, scheming, imagining, and wishing to secure what is going to be coming. We so often see how all our imaginations, fears, and hopes, they never happen. It never happened, plays out. I remember in Trungpa Rinpoche's house in Bia, up in what's now called the old Labrang, there used to be a poster on the wall, and there was it was taking a picture of the monster from the Wheel of Life, but in the middle it just had this little this little story where it says, once there was a man who had a nightmare in which he was being devoured by a monster. As the dream progressed, the monster crawling up on him, the man cried out in fear, "What are you going to do to me now?" And the monster says, "I don't know, it's your dream." And it's so often that we imagine that this, that, and the other is going to happen, and it never does. Never plays out exactly the way that we, especially when we're caught up in hope and fear. So with this imaginary script being narrated in our heads, we have a lot of hope and fear. So this is where we actually would be better off saying, well, things just happen. So of course, there's a lot of understanding of what exactly it is that are the conditions that there, but in the end, we could really just say things just happen. Trungpa Rinpoche says it is because there is nobody writing the script that so many varieties of things keep popping up. It's not that the thoughts happen particularly according to some logical pattern. Logically, they might be quite disassociated. Things just pop up. They happen out of nowhere. That doesn't mean that things don't happen on the basis of causes and conditions, but it's just that we're not, unless we're omniscient, we're not privy to exactly how they're going to pop up. So as far as we're concerned, they just happen to pop out of nowhere. So even though it is a bit mystical, then we just could say they just happen. Brilliant poster. So we want to trace back to before the thought which drives impulse. So as far as our experience goes, we have all these thoughts that pop up, but for us to then navigate, it's about not following the thoughts, but beginning to go back to the concepts. So we have these experiences of good, bad, and so forth. But as far as good and bad goes, it's really something that's driven and informed by our concepts of what good and bad is. So our thinking and impulses on the basis of our thinking, they're not going to help us. So it's more about us being sensitive to the reality. Something comes up that's just a thought. We just see what is there, and we're not caught up in our perceptions. We acknowledge that something is taking place, and we let go. This is the place where we can intuit how we could actually relate to the choices that we need to make. Just sitting and thinking, we so often think that we do that, but that's not necessarily really going to help us. It's more about us being free of the thoughts before, or rather going back to the place before the thought, and just actually just having you could say we will naturally reflect and so forth. That's for sure, but still, we're not jumping to conclusions, and we are just letting it go. And that's what Trungpa Rinpoche referred to as disowning. So this practice of disowning, he says, is like the yeast in the fermentation process. We're not going to have the finished brew right away. So right now there's a process in which we're uncertain, in which everything is not clear. We're thinking about what might happen. We're looking at the conditions, and we let go in the sense that we don't jump to conclusions. We don't drink the unfinished brew. We just let it sit there a bit. And that's the practice of disowning. So of course, the commentary happens, but it's not final. We have these sort of thoughts, worries, reflections. They're going on, but they're not final. So often with some of the great beings I came across, you would see that, they would just let things ferment a little bit before taking action. Just sort of seeing, sussing out, or being sensitive to the conditions in the situation. So again, as before, where we wanted a blueprint or a map, Trungpa Rinpoche says you cannot start from absolute complete perfection. Being perfect does not matter. Just perceive and experience and disown. The problem is that we always want to start something and at the same time make sure that what we are doing is right. But somehow we cannot have that kind of insurance. One really has to take a chance and accept the raw and rugged quality of the situation. Things happen out of our control and does so or do so appropriately, auspiciously. There is a choice. We can work with what is, or we can stumble along habitually. So we could be blind to the conditions in the situation and just sort of forge ahead according to how we normally do things. Or like we're suggesting here, allowing some fermentation, working with the actual conditions. There might be many choices, but one is straightforwardly there, seen by basic sanity. So like the Trungpa Rinpoche talks, we could have so many different choices, but there is one that is actually just right ahead of us. I think we even very often we say that the solution is very often just sitting in front of us, right? So it takes this intelligence or basic sanity to be sensitive or to be aware of that. But that doesn't mean that there's some sort of predestined, or rather that there is some sort of method now, that now there's a way we're going to know everything. It's never going to be like that. We're never going to know everything. Things have not been marked out for us. And that's where Trungpa Rinpoche, quoting from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, also known as the Bado Tudral, or the Great Liberation Through Hearing, that's where we talk about seeing the raw nature of our, you could say, luminous ground, and that's where it might just be overwhelming, and we sort of choose the dullness of our unconscious all ground. And the way it manifests then, as it described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, according to the teachings on the Bardo, then we have these encounters with the Tathagatas, brilliant. And because they're so brilliant, we might actually just choose to look to the side, to the dull light. Trungpa just says, this symbolism from the Tibetan Book of the Dead is very profound for our actual everyday life situation. It does not have to refer only to after-death experience. Perhaps the after-death experience just typifies the kind of situations in which choices are most enlightening or stimulating, and most immediate. In our ordinary life situation, we have to open ourselves and investigate and see, and then make a commitment. Without choice, there would be no leap and no moment of letting go at all. Because of choice, therefore, there is a moment of leap, and letting go happens. So making choices in the present moment is not particularly comforting, blissful, or easy. On the other hand, it could be inspiring. That much, at least, could be said. So here, Trungpa Rinpoche talks about working with the conditions that we're given and having a sensitivity then to the, you could say, the auspicious nature of the conditions that we are provided with. And that's where, again, as always, we will be able to navigate this once we're less entangled in our confusion, and there's more this aerial perspective of basic sanity. All of which then is premised on the practice of the path, and particularly the practice of meditation, where we begin to free ourselves from the grip of the habitual impulses and patterns. Now comes the last chapter, and this is taken from a book of Trungpa Rinpoche called Work, Sex and Money. I think it's the second last chapter. We actually have studied this in one of the previous online studies. And coda, I looked it up, it's sort of the at the end of the main piece of music, then you have a sort of concluding, finalizing piece of music. So that's what this chapter is. It's called Karma in Everyday Life. So here, work, sex, and money is it's a little bit a term that implies our ordinary reality, and very often there's a sense in the conventional notion of spirituality that there are certain things that you shouldn't get caught up in. Work, for example, that's just dreary, ordinary, the grind, right? And sex, that's going to distract us from the path. And money, that's dirty. And so there's this sort of a notion that our ordinary life, which is full of things like work, sex, and money, is not really compatible with spirituality. And that's where we have to, and that's what Trungpa Rinpoche says. He's not quite sure what kind of spirituality is being talked about here. And it sounds more like that's a pleasure-oriented spirituality, where you're sort of just, you'd like to sort of get the easier way out and just have particular sublime pleasure. But the thing is, this still is essentially ego-oriented. This sublime pleasure is just essentially allowing ego to achieve its ultimate dream, which is complete comfort. And so this is what we call spiritual materialism. And this kind of pleasure-oriented spirituality, he says, in such spirituality, the path is seen as a shortcut to fulfillment, not subject to the actual work other pleasures require. So in fact, the reality is that work is actually work. So is sex, so is money. And so the general experience in our life is actually that everything comes at a cost, but it's as if there's some notion that if you're just on the side of, the sublime, everything is going to be all of a sudden come to you. So this is very facile, very easy from the point of view of ego. It very much plays into a rather naive set of expectations. If you're on the right side, then the side of the good, then you get what you want. You've been a good boy and girl, and you've done according to what the great authority that's going to give you everything you wanted on the basis of your submission, then, it's all going to come your way. Buddhism, however, begins with the empirical dimension of our existing experience. This is the honest, straightforward reality that we know. So our entire existence is what we're questioning here. So are we going to just do we want to seal ourselves off to avoid realities such as work, sex, and money? And that is where this limited idea of spirituality as being hiding away or sealing ourselves off into a particular compartment or compartmentalized realm is going to be at odds with or in conflict with the reality that extends far beyond that. So at the end of the day, it will be essentially a practice of avoidance. There's a higher approach that goes beyond such insecurity, because that whole approach is based on an assumption that ego has existence. And that's where ego, with its non-existent, continually operates within this fear and this insecurity. And that's what leads us to naively dream of some sort of like alternative dimension. Luckily, the Buddha discovered we don't necessarily exist in that way. And this assumption around the true existence of ego that feeds this insecurity is a hoax. It's a bluff. And that's where the Buddha pointed beyond this cycle altogether. Trungpa says there are actually possibilities of transcending both good and bad karma. Both good and bad karma, as we have already explained, come from a repetitive pattern. No psychic powers we might be able to develop, no higher spiritual powers can transcend both good and bad karma. That has to be worked out on the earth level, on the basic ground of earth. So we can't go into some sort of incredible dimension of having some particular psychic powers where forever we're going to be beyond any conditioning. We're going to have to look at reality. We can't operate with just this dream. And that's why we're talking about working this out on earth level, on the level of this empirical or tangible dimension of what is reality for us. So when we have the various actions that we engage with that drive our various experiences, these being the actions of our body and our mind and so forth. Prior to these, what we do and so forth, they're the concepts and attitudes. And this also goes beyond then the sort of the ordinary behaviorism where we would say, what's the right thing to do? What's the wrong thing to do? Well, actually, in the Buddhist context, we would say, well, that depends what your attitude is. What is your motivation? What are the concepts behind? So it's these concepts and attitudes that lie at the basis of our impulses and so forth and our actions, and that's where the cycle of ego's confusion, what we call samsara and so forth, is premised on these seeds that continually give us the notion of basically what we looked at in the skandhas is the notion of what we call high, low, good, bad, and so forth, particularly in the third skandha of perception, when we begin to see, oh, this is comfortable, this is not comfortable, I'm drawn to this, I'm not drawn to that, you know, I dislike that, then we begin to label things in a particular way. So these seeds, they lie then on the basis then for the actions that we take. So there's seeds there, good, bad, right, wrong, all of that. They create mental and physical results. They play out in the way that we engage with the world, in the way that we project the world. So this is where, again, going back to the notion of skandhas altogether, these concepts thus create me and mine. And then there's all of that there is me, and then there's how I define myself in terms of my possessions, my surroundings, and so forth. And then there's all the frustrations that go with that. The fact that we can't hold on to anything, the fact that what we don't want comes our way, and so forth. So we can't find a solution on the premises of our confusion. That's not going to work. Trungpa Rinpoche says, there we are. That is the situation which we have been talking about throughout this book. Us being limited by our actions. What can we do about it? In some sense, we can't do anything about it. We might try to find some happy medium, but that doesn't seem to work here. Happy medium is where you make a compromise. You cool down the pleasure and cool down the pain. Then you get a mixture of the two in a very toned down way. That doesn't really solve anything. So that's the kind of the notion sometimes of how am I going to avoid the difficulties in life? Well, I'll just avoid life altogether. I'll have very little life. If I just have a little life, maybe I won't have too much suffering. So of course, this, like Trungpa Rinpoche says, doesn't really solve anything at all. We haven't touched the basis. Auspiciousness, and this is a question now, auspiciousness and condition being inseparable from the karmic structure, right and wrong at the same time, two poles presently curious. Is this developing sacred outlook, or is it something different? Well, sacred outlook is actually when we are free from the karmic conditioning. And that is indeed where we're beginning to, yes, we are beginning to see that which lies beyond cause and effect. There is some sense of a sacred dimension within our karmic structure. Then again, sacred outlook altogether is something that lies beyond karma entirely. But yes, we'll come back to sacred outlook again and again. I'm not sure we're going to be doing it here, but let's just say sacred outlook is where we begin to appreciate the reality without the, or that we have an outlook or a view that acknowledges that phenomena exist without our projections. So it is a little bit hinted at here, but sacred outlook is the acknowledgement that there's no impurity, neither within ourselves nor within the phenomenal world. So that's the basis for the Vajrayana outlook and what we call sacred outlook. Yeah. Here, we're still working more with, we're definitely working with the flexibility and you could say, the understanding of the emptiness of karma, but we're yet not really touching on the notion of what we call pure perception as such. Anyway, this just understanding the karma and the emptiness of karma is essential in the practice of the entire Buddhist path. So that's where just being overwhelmed by phenomena and just saying, I'll have a small life, please. I'll have a bland drink. Then this is not going to solve anything. So that's where when we're practicing the path and we're practicing meditation, we ask rather than asking, how am I going to do? Then we ask, who is, or well, how am I going to find my way? Then we look rather at who's lost to begin with, who is bewildered, and that's where we don't find anybody there to identify. Now, this we've talked about in the previous chapter. Not finding anything, we actually begin to familiarize ourselves with that, and we needn't cover up that naked experience. So here we're talking about moving away from this spiritual materialism of wanting to just stay with the ego and its assumptions and premises. We are looking into it, we're finding that nothing is actually there to begin with. That's what it's a bit like, also from the sutras, there's the example of if somebody throws a stone after a dog, then usually what the dog is, it stands there and barks at the stone. And that's what we do when we just assume, oh yeah, there's here I am, and how am I going to satisfy myself? But that's never going to really put an end to it. So you throw the stone at the dog, and we can keep throwing stones at this dog. Sorry for the sort of, this is slightly situated within cultures that unfortunately throw stones at dogs, but anyway, keep missing what's the cause. The dog barks at the stone, right? Misses the cause. They say if you throw a stone at a lion doesn't care about the stone. It looks around to see who threw that stone. So that's cutting straight to where the cause lies. And that's where, in us turning around and asking, well, who is it that's lost? Who is it that's suffering? Who is it that's, undergoing this turmoil? Rather than trying to sort of continue being fooled by this deception, we turn around, we look, and we find there is actually just a hoax. Not finding anything, we're okay with that. We needn't cover up that naked experience. Of course, habitually, not easy. And that's why the structure of meditation is very helpful. There's the discipline of the path that's very helpful, that facilitates us actually going through with it. It's like if you try to you try to bathe a kid that doesn't want to have a shower or a bath, well, where they sort of might get out before they're clean, but we know they need to sort of, we need to get in everywhere and get them clean. So in that sense, we need to get to the bottom of things here. So the thing about us not finding anything, there's nothing that we can label, that we're actually stuck with experience rather than dogma and sort of labels and so on. That actually is the key to our freedom. So we begin to appreciate that we might not have anything to hold on to, and that's actually okay. The initial fear of there being nothing, that is the source of our bewilderment. That is the basis for duality, that we actually want there to be something, they want to be an other. So if we look at this basic moment of bewilderment, and here of course Trungpa Rinpoche is very much drawing from the Mahamudra and the Dzogchen understanding, we would say basic bewilderment, the original ground, it is followed by confusion. This means that when the ground bewilderment is there, then it's basically a condition of not knowing. It's just so that's just a condition of unconsciousness. Now that is followed then by confusion, where we begin to label and relate to our essentially what is our own expression, but we begin to see it as other, and that's where we begin to label it. So this is the moment that we would say samsara originates. So what in the end confusion is, and what we're living, is this conflict between you could say, the identity, the ground itself, and its expression. And that's where we have duality. Where we would say the Buddha is free, is understanding that the expression is not an other, and where sentient beings, they wander in samsara, is that they see the expression as being other. So this is something that, if you sometimes come across a beautiful liturgy called the Prayer of Kuntuzangpo, or the Prayer of Samantabhadra, it discusses this. Trungpa Rinpoche says, when bewilderment becomes confusion, it's a very cunning trick in which you give up searching for anything. I don't care whether I exist or not, but there is something here. So let's call that me. And then my relationship to that is confusion, which is true. Sorry, you don't actually know what's going on, but you stumble along. So this is where we have in philosophy and so on, we have a lot of speculations about how do we exist and so forth. But all the time operating within a realm of thinking. What we're doing here, however, is more than thinking. We're actually going in and experiencing, and that is the foundation for the path of meditation. That's the basis for working with our reality. So we are both selfless and selfish. We think we need to be selfish to have an identity. So we know the value of selflessness, and yet we fall into being selfish, and we very often have this completely delusional idea that we actually need to have some sort of selfishness to survive. Not at all true. We operate ridiculously when we attempt that, and we succeed when we operate from the point of view of selflessness, wider perspective. We have, and that's the thing also, we might be terribly selfish, but then again, selflessness happens all the time. So even in the most confused situations, then very often there is just some glimpses of selflessness. This happens all the time. So we have glimpses of freedom from bewilderment, the light shines through. Meditation provides the space to see through basic bewilderment prior to tantrum. So before we get all caught up in our neurosis and act them out, meditation is actually something that enables us to catch ourselves before we get tangled up in our impulses. Not just in our impulses, but even in the concepts that drive these impulses. So it's not so much about stopping ourselves, but it's more just about not allowing this ignorance to play out. So in meditation, we touch on the space beyond bewilderment. So with the practice of sitting, we begin to have some connection with that where there is not a bewilderment happening. Now, here we say this ground is not itself passive, but it is the ground of energy. So sorry, the basic bewilderment is in itself passive. This ground is in itself passive, but yet it's also from there that energy arises. And we would say this energy in some way, even though it's not identical to, it is its expression. And when that energy is filtered through bewilderment, then it is just mechanical intelligence. So energy is happening all the time. There's a luminous quality to our reality, and yet when it's filtered through bewilderment, then we're filtered through ego, then this, what is otherwise very creative energy, becomes just, you could say, about survival. It's mechanical intelligence. Trungpa Rinpoche says this intelligence is going to search for bliss or express pain. It's sort of a guided missile, a missile guided by the bewilderment. But the handle on basic bewilderment, its exit is energy. Bewilderment's way of relating with situations is energy. So the way that we are operating is from the place of this energy that's fed or grounded in original bewilderment. That, of course, is where we are perpetuating the patterns of samsara. Getting to the bottom of this confused energy, and addressing the issue of bewilderment is where we begin to free ourselves from samsara. So, the possibility in the nature of the path and the practice of meditation is when this energy is free from bewilderment, there is no panic. So whatever situation we have, is if we're not operating from the point of view of confusion, then there's not panic, or we're not operating from the point of view of bewilderment. From that, ultimately, then we would say there is none of ego's graspings. That's of course when we are completely free from ordinary confusion. So, as much as that might be something that we're not experiencing right now immediately, then this ground is nevertheless there. And so we have flashes of this ground occasionally. We rejoice in somebody, for example, being generous. That doesn't help us, right? We're not getting anything out of it. And at the same time, we rejoice in it. So we might be, sort of neurotic, possessive, greedy, and so forth. And then we see generosity, and there might actually be a moment where we just go, wow, that's beautiful. So this happens. There's flashes of that all around. Egolessness comes as momentary insights. And we recognize egolessness, we rejoice in it, and it's also something that we begin to cultivate through the practice of the path, a wider perspective. Then egolessness becomes more and more something that feels real. So, in the state free of concepts, there is no karma. So if we could be, the degree to which we could settle into this lack of bewilderment, lack of concepts, not being driven by habitual patterns, we are freeing ourselves from these patterns of karma. In that nature, in and of itself, the nature of reality, there is no self. And also there's no labels of good and bad. So this is what we occasionally would recognize. In fact, we recognize it more often than we think. We naturally rejoice in selflessness. We appreciate open-mindedness and so forth. So we recognize how sometimes labels of good and bad are in fact just relative. It's even funny. One person will think something is incredibly good, and somebody will think something's terribly bad. You might have somebody who grew up in a culture where, as an expression of appreciation for the food, then at the end of the meal, you sort of give out a good, long, healthy burp. And then you might end up dining at some table in, let's say, countries like England or Denmark, where it's considered extremely rude, and you might just think they're sitting there and thinking, oh, this is so good, and you give out a big burp. It's seen as being completely bad. And that's why we can see it's not in the object in and of itself that there's good or bad, but in fact, it's really just conditioned labels. So this sort of recognition of relativity and understanding the lack of self is something that continually enables us to break the games and the rigidity, the narrowness of ego. So, and I think we're sort of heading towards the end of the last chapter here. I think Trungpa Rinpoche, the last words here from Trungpa Rinpoche says, in that way, the whole way we work with our life is approached in a very sane way, with nobody trying to save anything or anybody, nobody labeling anything as good or bad. Work, sex, and money are not regarded as good or bad, but are seen in a very awake way, because fundamentally there is nobody. To put it more bluntly, egolessness is a kind of momentary flash. There are occasional breaks in our experience of ego. It's from there, those breaks in ego's game, that we can approach work, sex, and money. In that case, work, sex, and money becomes part of a very natural approach. End of quote. So here Trungpa Rinpoche is identifying spirituality as not being compartmentalized. It's about embracing reality, but in embracing reality, also embracing non-existence, like we also looked in the previous chapter, that phenomena don't have the kind of existence that we ordinarily attribute, and for us to begin to break that habitual way of looking at things is a bit like the lion that turns around and looks who threw that stone. So this is what we're proposing here, to actually begin to familiarize ourselves with egolessness, to not be deceived by this the narrowness of buying into the ignorance of ego. So here the proposition around karma is continually to be more awake. And with being more awake does not mean that, and understanding what we could call the empty nature of phenomena does not mean that we're beginning to be disconnected from our reality. In fact, we become more engaged with reality when we're not caught up in these reactive patterns. So the more that we begin to understand the conditioned nature and the functioning of karma, we also become free from karma. So that's so much of what lies in, or that's an important point in not the key point really in Trungpa Rinpoche's work here on karma, and it's also key really in any explanation of karma. I'm just going to finish off with a few quotes that some of you might be familiar with. If you studied Introduction to the Middle Way, the Madhyamika Avatara, then in the Jamgami Rinpoche at one point he says, to the extent that one gains an understanding of emptiness, one will be convinced of the truth of karma, the principle of cause and effect. So this is really such, you could say that's the hallmark really of understanding emptiness, is that one is much more careful with cause and effect. And again, the famous quote from Guru Rinpoche, where he says, although my view is higher than the sky, in regard to cause and effect, my actions are finer than barley flour. Again, this understanding of how the two work together. And hence also Longchenpa in his 30 pieces of advice from the heart, and this is the second last of the 30 pieces, it says, in the midst of emptiness, acting according to the law of cause and effect, having understood non-action, keeping the 3 vows, with absolute compassion, may we strive for the benefit of all beings. To unite the 2 accumulations is my advice from the heart. So with an understanding of the nature of reality, which is conditioned and doesn't have any inherent reality, nevertheless, phenomena appear. And that's where we still working within the conditions of phenomena, we abide by the law of cause and effect. We understand the nature of emptiness, and in terms of our practice, we familiarize ourselves with this non-action or non-existence, simply just the condition of being. And we do so on the basis of our discipline, which we practice in terms of the 3 vows, the fundamental vow of determination to be free from samsara, the vow of the bodhisattva of not retreating into a private little cozy nirvana, but rather dedicating ourselves to all sentient beings and being open to reality, even though it doesn't have anything that we can latch onto. This is the vision and practice of the bodhisattva. And the final commitment or spiritual vow then is that of the Vajrayana, that sees the unconditional purity intrinsic to our own nature and also to reality, which what we call the vow of the Vijayadhara. So just to say that in terms of understanding this vipassana, we apply it in terms of integrating it through the path and according to our particular capacity, according to whichever vow that we're abiding by, or possibly all 3 vows. And so, and that is very much, you could say, key to all of Tibetan Buddhism, to unite these 3 vows. But in doing so, then we abide with absolute compassion, which is a compassion that is free from duality, And within that, we strive for the benefit of all beings. So to unite the two accumulations is my advice from the heart, the relative accumulation of merit and the absolute accumulation of wisdom. So these are just some classical quotes really that reflect the theme that has been running throughout the work that we've studied here. And from my side, I think that's where I'd like to leave it. And of course, I'd like to say a work like this is something that every time we read it, we'll find so many new facets and insights. So we shouldn't think that this study is over, but really we are just beginning the study, and it's been a privilege to present this to you. And of course, like I started off saying, my presentation of this is in no way a digest, an accurate digest of what Trungpa Rinpoche is saying, but rather just this is to the best of my ability, what I thought are some of the important points in this work. But of course, you need to have your own relationship with this work, and definitely need to read this book for oneself and then do it again and again. Okay. Okay, so see here. Thank you so much for reading the material by myself. I wasn't able to make a lot of sense, but your explanation followed by rereading of the material make things much clearer. Well, thank you very much, and also some other people are very generous in their appreciations. Thank you very much. Okay, that's good. Okay, well, I think we've done something good here, so let's dedicate the merit. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom and attain the two supreme kayas, which arise from merit and wisdom. So, thank you.